and good morning, everyone. Uh, I would never want to underplay it, but fear is a great way to sell stuff. Just in general, keeping people scared seems to be a theme. And so we start going on about the vaccine's efficacy, and that people are catching it without after having had the vaccine. And the truth is, the vaccine seems to be pretty darn effective. We have some strain variants, and that is a concern. The number one thing is, and because we're starting to see a surge again, we don't have enough people vaccinated, and we still need to maintain the appropriate kinds of, disease-preventing practices, social distancing and masks and stuff. And it is an interesting game as well, in that, I can show you my vaccine card, but I think until we have enough people, the vaccine becomes an issue of the haves and the have-nots, and that ain't fair, particularly at this point where we really don't have complete wide open distribution. And so, it's an issue. But be that as it may, we've been talking about viruses, and we're hitting now into some of the things that herpes virus can do. And when we're talking viruses, it's a little bit different than thinking about animal species. Is that viral classification is a pretty broad kind of phenomenon, in that we have a whole range of viruses that are very similar. And because viruses don't interact with each other, we don't have the same kind of notion of how we define species, which is, in the animal world, it is two organisms that can mate and produce a viable offspring, and that would do this kind of in the wild. And with viruses, because they don't interact that way, species become something about sequence. And so we've got a class of viruses that we refer to as the herpes viruses, but they have a variety of different kinds of manifestations. They typically are all interacting with the neurons, I think it's probably fair to say, and certainly they generate a range of different kinds of effects. So we got cold sores, we got chicken pox. Chicken pox in later life can manifest itself as shingles. So another one of these things of having the same virus but different names. And so here are a whole range of different herpes viruses. This is where we finished up last time. Epstein-Barr is the bulk of mononucleosis cases. It's also associated with chronic fatigue and things like that. And so herpes viruses are quite the variety, and they do a lot of things to people. Just as a little point, again with viral life cycle, we have the viral particle enshrouded in a membrane. It's got to bind to a protein on the cell surface. This is what determines its specificity. If you can't bind to the cell surface, you can't get in. If you can't get in, you're not going to be infectious. So there are viruses all around us, but if they don't have the appropriate receptor mechanism to get into our cells, it's nothing. And so, the idea that we have millions and millions of different viruses around us, yeah, but most of them are bacteria viruses. Most of them have, no way to get into us, and even if they did, they couldn't operate inside of us. There are really a very small handful of the viruses in the population that can infect us and do something. So the molecular, or the information, the DNA actually gets into the nucleus, and then we go into this pathway where we take the viral DNA, turn it into RNA, and then able to get it translated into protein. The proteins can self-assemble. The viral nucleic acid comes out of the cytoplasm, and they are then spit back out. And so we've got the standard kind of infection cycle going on here. One of the things that is interesting with herpes viruses is they often exhibit latency. That is, they'll go into the lysogenic pathway. remember in the bacteriophage world, we have these two terms, the lytic pathway, where you're blowing the cell apart, and the lysogenic pathway, where you form what's known as a stable lysogen, that your genetic information actually integrates into the chromosome. And that means that the virus can infect, get into the cell, and be a long-term infection. You, in fact, can't even get rid of it because the virus is integrated into the genome. It's not exhibiting the cell surface proteins and such, and so you hold it. I say it's self-conscious people don't know what I'm saying. So, the HSV, herpes simplex virus, it's getting in through little micro tears in the epithelium, and its primary spot is neurons, and it forms a latent infection in the dorsal root ganglia, that is in the sort of the middle part of the neuron. And reactivation is going to cause the virus to start packaging itself up. Reactivation is often going to happen when the host's immune response is a little low. You start to get tired, you have another kind of infection, stress. These are the kind of things that can start to do this. So some viral genomes actually can make their way all the way up to the central nervous system, which is a pretty ugly thing to have viruses in the brain. So you get this release of viruses, and you actually start having an acute phase of where the virus is infecting other cells, and that is what results in a herpes outbreak. With things like chickenpox, it's still in the neurons, and during stress, after the flu, particularly as you get older, you can start to have it manifest itself as shingles. Here's another kind of virus that you're probably familiar with, measles. It used to be that, when I was in college, you could say, okay, how many people have had measles? And tons of people raised their hand. Measles are not that severe. They do cause some death, for sure. And so it's reasonable to get a vaccine for it. And the vaccine works really well. It's a enveloped minus strand RNA virus. And if you get it, you end up with a fever, a rash, you have the measles. And so in the U.S. now that we have vaccine, which is the MMR vaccine, measles is pretty darn rare. If you're in the healthcare biz, you quite likely don't see a case of measles come through. And measles have been one of the early vaccine systems. And we've got places, particularly that tend to have a lot of migrant workers and things that aren't vaccinated, they start to have cases coming along. But it's, not a whole lot of reported cases. You think about, the flu or COVID, and these are like nothing numbers. Let's see. We can go through a little bit of the measles life cycle. This is an RNA virus. That means that we're going to have some different kinds of things with the RNA is going to either get itself into the nucleus, or the RNA is going to just simply, in this case, replicate itself and then be able to generate its own protein that can then begin to actually package itself up, and then it comes back out through budding, and so consequently it's going to share some of the cell surface protein of the cell infected. And this is sort of a standard kind of RNA virus. So this is an example of how we can have a virus that doesn't have the ability to become a latent kind of virus. It's not getting into the genome. Another paramyxovirus is what causes mumps. And it's a fairly mild disease. You have swelling of salivary glands, and that kind of gives the characteristic lumpy face. fever, headache. It can cause some issues that you can end up with a variety of different kinds of side effects from it. They're not as common. So the vaccine is not completely effective, but it's pretty good. And so you end up having the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and that, of course, is the third, that's the R in MMR. Rubella is the German measles. And so it is, again, a fairly mild issue. The main concern is that in pregnant women, you can have some real severe developmental problems, deafness, eye problems, heart problems, and spontaneous abortion. So, again, with the vaccine, it's pretty much eliminated from our population. It still comes in from different parts of the world. So, this is the MMR vaccine and its effectiveness. It actually works really, really well. So, the measles tend to be sort of seasonal, and we start with the vaccine in the mid-60s, and the cases drop dramatically. So the second dose recommendation that we all now have is able to even further reduce the little seasonal bump. And one dose works quite well. 2 doses really does a very good job. So we really have no measles and rubella. Mumps is very, very low. And this is an example of what vaccinations and vaccines can do. Now, one of the things I think is interesting with this is that with the measles, mumps, rubella vaccination, it's on a rolling process. You have little kids going into the doctor's, the pediatrician's office, getting ready for school. You have to have your immunizations. And so we've got this sort of continuous rolling immunization schedule going on. Every pediatric office is able to administer this. With COVID, we have the entire country at one time needing the vaccine, and that presents some pretty serious logistic problems. But this is a case, an example of vaccines absolutely knocking the virus back to pretty much zero. Whether we're going to get that with COVID, I think remains to be seen. One of the things that if you talk to people that are concerned about vaccines is the potential link between vaccinations and autism. And this is unfortunate in that there really is no good statistical analysis that associates this, other than the fact that kids, when they're 2, get their first dose of MMR, and that is about the same time that kids with learning disabilities, autism, begin to be recognized. And so it is an associative issue. It is not a causative issue. And, I have a child, and it is something to be anxious about. And you never, you can't really know your child's abilities and how they're developing until you watch it progress. And so it just doesn't have a whole lot of correlation going on. And so this is a couple of different graphs that have been used. And what we've got then is misuse of statistics. In this case, we're not accounting for a change in the population. And you can, by doing mistaken statistical analysis, begin to show that MMR is going up, or that autism is going up. When we actually do the statistical analysis more carefully, it really has no actual correlation to it. So vaccines are not 100% safe, but they're pretty darn safe. And I think we can be pretty clear that vaccines are not going to be causing autism. Now, they are cranking your immune system up. There are things that vaccines might be doing. But from a public health standpoint, it's a really important tool. All right, here is another lovely virus. I don't want it, thank you. Human papillomavirus, HPV. And HPV can be a variety of different strains that cause slightly different pathologies. You can get This is the viral type that's responsible for warts. Then there are very specific parts of the body that can pick things up, like genital warts, which are, as the name implies, located on your genitals. The dermal wart are typically located on the feet and fingers and things like that. They're generally not an issue. So they will resolve in time, but they can actually cause, abrasions and difficulties depending on where they are. But it takes a while to actually knock for your immune system to knock the virus back and to actually treat the wart. One of the standard ways and treatments for these things is actual ablation, where you take either a bit of acid or, my favorite, is a drop of liquid nitrogen and freeze the entire area. That kills off those cells that are carrying the virus, and it's easier than scooping it out with a little knife or a melon scooper. So we talked a little bit about cancer, and this isn't the latest, but this is actually some pretty good stuff here. HPV is associated with a whole range of different cancers. Cervical cancer and pretty high grade, that is serious cervical cancer, there is a pretty good association with the HPV. So the standard way that cervical cancer is observed is through pap smears and screening. This pretty much is going to show the possibility of cervical cancer once it's actually started and pretty far along. So there's a pretty good reason to think that universal vaccination against the HPV would be a really useful thing. So are we going to start having a universal vaccination? I don't know. We should. All right, here are a couple of things that used to be an issue, but we don't have to really worry about them anymore, and some ugly photos. Different kinds of pox viruses, smallpox, and then the less dangerous cowpox. I'm not sure when the last smallpox vaccine was administered, but I got my smallpox vaccination. And this is a vaccination that ends up giving you a little scar. Why it was administered this way, I have no idea, but that's how it was. Is they had a little ring with all these little jabby, triangles on it, and they'd dip the ring into a vaccine solution, and then they'd start kind of poking you in the arm, and you'd develop this really big scab, and it was moderately painful, but you are vaccinated against smallpox. And the vaccine works well, the program worked well, and really there is no smallpox floating around. Let's see. So it really has been eradicated. There is potentially stores of it at different installations, and the DNA sequence of it is known. The smallpox genome was actually replicated and built using just the DNA sequence, and that's a slight problem, but it is so big that the ability to do that is limited. It's not something that your average sort of bioterrorist would pick up. Anyway, that's smallpox. And we're going to pick up on more viruses on Monday. We're going to knock off here. So, no class Friday. If you are going someplace, make sure not to bring back any unwelcome visitors. And we'll catch up on Monday. So, this afternoon, we will be looking at some cultures and seeing what information we can get from them. And so make sure you remind me, or we'll put them in the spot in the incubator that I can pull your plates out tomorrow and wrap them up for you. Okay? Cool. And so now I'll take this extra 30 minutes and work on grading the exams.
Will you put them in Moodle?
I'm not really going to do it.
Could you email us maybe?
I can, yes.
Please.
No. Oh, that's what Friday's going to be, my catch-up day.
No.
It's really